Yes, please, thumbs up.
No. 30 seconds for that one. Okay. All right. Okay.
Okay, 6 p.m. Good evening and welcome to the special meeting of Troy City Council for Friday, March 31st. It is 6 p.m. You are in council chambers. My name is William Lutz, President of Council. This time I'll ask Mrs. Knight to please call the roll.
Mr. Whidden?
Here.
Mrs. Snee? Here. Mr. Twist?
Here.
Mrs. Marshall? Here. Mr. Rozell?
Here.
Mr. Pierce?
Present.
Mr. Schilling?
Present.
Mr. Sievert? Mr. Phillips?
Motion to excuse Mr. Sievert.
Second. It's been moved to excuse Mr. Sievert by Mr. Twist, seconded by Mr. Pierce. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mrs. Snee? Yes. Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert is excused.
Move to excuse Mr. Phillips.
Second. It has been moved to excuse Mr. Phillips by Mrs. Snee, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips is excused.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the reading and acknowledgement of the notice of the special meeting of Troy City Council for Friday, March 31st, 2023?
Notice a special meeting of the City Council to Mrs. Marshall, Mr. Pierce, Mr. Phillips, Mr. Rozell, Mr. Schilling, Mr. Sievert, Mrs. Snee, Mr. Twist, Mr. Whidden, Mr. Lutz. You are hereby notified that there will be a special meeting of the City Council of the City of Troy, Ohio, at the council chambers in said city on Friday, the 31st day of March, 2023 at 6 p.m. for the purpose of considering R24-2023, bidding miscellaneous water meter parts, R25, design of Maple Street and Peters Road Waterline Project, R26, bid Maple Street and Peters Line Waterline Project, R27-2023, sole source agreement for storage for Police Department body camera system, R26-2023, sole source agreement for automatic license plate reading camera system, O17-2023, property appropriation, West Main Street, project parcel DO8 035430, Aaron E. Kerner. Ordinance number 06-2023, property appropriation, West Main Street project parcel DO8 035400, Ruby Burton. And ordinance number 19-2023, property appropriation, West Main Street project parcel DO8 091600, WMAM Prop Holdings LLC. Meeting is called by Council President Lutz pursuant to Rule 25 of the Troy City Council Rules of Procedure. I will now pass the notice around to be signed.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. To begin tonight's proceedings with committee reports, we have 5 reports to be heard. The first 2 are from the Building and Utilities Committee and Mrs. Marshall.
All right. Committee members Whidden and Marshall met March 27th to consider authorizing bidding miscellaneous water meter parts for the calendar years 2023 to 2025, consolidating the purchase of these items into a single bid for a 3-year period should lock in unit pricing and secure a supplier. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for miscellaneous water meter parts for calendar years 2023 through 2025 at a cost not to exceed $138,000 for each calendar year. Respectfully submitted, Mr. Twist, Mr. Whidden, and Mrs. Marshall, myself as chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Marshall. Are there any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, you can go ahead with your second report.
Committee members Whidden and Marshall met on the 27th of March to consider 2 items regarding the Maple Street and Peters Road Waterline Improvement Project. The city plans to replace the undersized water main on Maple Street. In addition, the city's 6-inch water main in Peters Road is undersized and in bad condition. The city and the county have parallel water lines on Peters Road. Good engineering practice would be having a single water line with the city's 6-inch water line on Peters Road being abandoned and the city taking over the county's 16-inch water line in this area. This is agreeable to the county. This would require an additional design work and increase the project cost. Funding is available in the water fund, including adjusting the scope of another project. The project scope and funding are further discussed in the detailed report. It is a recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared to authorize the Director of Public Service and Safety to enter into a professional service agreement with the firm Access Engineering LLC for the design of the Maple Street and Peters Road Improvement Project at a total cost not to exceed $69,000 for the design services, as well as to authorize the Director of Public Service and Safety to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for the Maple Street and Peters Road Waterline Improvement Project at a cost not to exceed $650,000. Respectfully submitted by Mr. Twist, Mr. Whidden, and Mrs. Marshall, myself as chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Marshall. Are there any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, move on to the Law and Ordinance Committee, and Mrs. Snee with 2 reports.
Thank you, Mr. President. This committee met March 27th to consider authorizing a sole source purchase of additional storage related to the Troy Police Department body camera system. When the city obtained the body camera system in 2022, it included a server for storage. Based on the retention schedule for the recordings, additional storage will be needed. A grant has been approved to fully fund the purchase of additional storage. As the storage must be compatible with the body camera system, it has been determined that a contract can be issued to Motorola Solutions Incorporated as a sole source vendor. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to execute a contract with Motorola Solutions Incorporated as a sole source vendor for the additional storage needed for the Troy Police Department WatchGuard body camera system at a cost not to exceed $71,790, so that the purchase can be accomplished by June 30th to meet the deadline for spending the grant dollars. This committee supports emergency legislation. This is respectfully submitted by Mr. Phillips, Mr. Sievert, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Snee. Are there any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, please continue.
This committee met March 27th to consider authorizing a sole source government agency agreement with Flock Group Incorporated for a 24-month period to obtain an automatic license plate reading camera, ALPR system, and the technology to record other unique features and the sharing of information with other law enforcement agencies at a cost not to exceed $57,150. Based on the unique technology of the Flock system that is not provided by another company and the expedient information sharing with other law enforcement entities that this system provides, the company has been identified as a sole source vendor and individual bidding by the city is not required. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to execute a sole source government agency agreement with Flock Group Incorporated for a 24-month period to obtain an automatic license plate reading camera, ALPR system, at a cost not to exceed $57,150. And this is respectfully submitted by Mr. Phillips, Mr. Sievert, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Snee. Are there any comments or questions from council members on this report?
I'd just like to confirm that we're going to hold that over for another reading, as Todd Sievert had requested.
Correct.
Okay.
This will go to a second reading. That second reading will be on Monday. Standing in for Mr. Phillips in the Streets and Sidewalks Committee is Mrs. Snee. Would you please read that report?
Thank you. This committee met March 27th to consider recommending legislation related to the appropriation of 3 properties in order for the city to proceed with the West Main Street Improvement Project Phase 2. To relocate utilities in the project area, easements are required for over 60 properties and have been obtained for all but 3 locations. As discussions with the property owners are ongoing, agreement may be reached with some of the owners prior to legislation being enacted. However, the city must be in a position to file the easement paperwork with the Ohio Department of Transportation in order to meet the project timeline of right-of-way acquisition and certification for the project to be bid in the fall of 2023 and funding provided to assist with the project cost. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Law and the Director of Public Service and Safety to file necessary paperwork for the appropriation of the parcels identified in the detailed report, as it is imperative that the city be in a position to proceed with any action required so that the utilities can be relocated to meet the timeline for bidding to receive funding. Emergency legislation is supported, and this is respectfully submitted by Mr. Pierce, myself, and Mr. Phillips as chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Snee. Are there any comments or questions on this report?
Go.
Mr. Schilling?
Mr. Titternick, I do have a question on the easement that we're purchasing. I mean, we will be offering what fair market value and also consideration of depreciation of the property because the roadway may or may not be closer to their building. Is that would be a fair estimate of what's happening?
Sure. The appropriation process is set up so that in the case where projects need to continue while negotiations go on for fair market value, they can do so, and either the magistrate or the judge or some mediator gets involved. And it can be anywhere from impasse or not being able to make contact and keep communications going with the property owner. In this case, well, in all cases, before it goes to appropriation, and specifically in this case, we've had a contract appraiser that has been doing this work for us, and we have already made our best offer to them. There's some extenuating circumstances on at least one of these properties where it's in a state, so there's a little longer process that we have to go through, but because time is of the essence, we're recommending the appropriation, requesting the appropriation process to keep this project going forward.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Titternick. Any other comments or questions? It's now time for citizen comments for items on the agenda. We have 5 resolutions and 3 ordinances for deliberation. If you wish to address council on any of those items, you're invited to come to the podium, give your name and address. You have 2 minutes to address council. Mr. Kerber will be our timekeeper this evening. Seeing none, we'll go into resolutions. We'll ask Mrs. Knight to read the first resolution of the evening, Resolution R-24, 2023.
Resolution number R-24, 2023. Resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for the miscellaneous water meter parts for years 2023 to 2025. Cost not to exceed $138,000 per calendar year. First reading.
Move to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Whitten to suspend the 3 reading rule, seconded by Mr. Twist. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whitten?
Yes.
Mrs. Sneed?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes. Move to adopt.
Second.
3 reading rule has been suspended. Move to adopt the resolution by Mr. Twist, seconded by Mrs. Snee. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whitten?
Yes.
Mrs. Sneed?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the next resolution of the evening, Resolution R-25, 2023.
Resolution number R-25, 2023. Resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to enter into an agreement for professional services with Access Engineering Solutions, LLC, of Salina, Ohio, for design services for the Maple Street and Peters Road water line replacement project. Design services cost not to exceed $69,000. First reading.
Move to suspend.
Second.
It has been moved to suspend the 3 reading rule by Mr. Twist, seconded by Mr. Pierce. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whitten?
Yes.
Mrs. Sneed?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second. 3 reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Twist, seconded by Mr. Whitten. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whitten?
Yes.
Mrs. Sneed?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the next resolution of the evening, Resolution R-26, 2023.
Resolution number R-26, 2023, resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for the Maple Street and Peters Road water line replacement project. cost not to exceed $650,000. First reading.
Move to suspend?
Second.
It has been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Whidden, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Twist, seconded by Mr. Whidden. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the next resolution of the evening, Resolution R27, 2023?
Resolution number R27, 2023, resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to enter into a contract with Motorola Solutions, Inc., a sole source vendor, for digital storage related to the Police Department body cam system and declaring an emergency. This cost is not to exceed $71,790. The city has a grant to pay 100% of the cost. This is the first reading.
Move to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Pierce, seconded by Mrs. Snee. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes. Move to adopt.
Second.
It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mrs. Snee, seconded by Mr. Twist. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the last resolution of the evening, Resolution R28, 2023?
Resolution number R28, 2023, resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to enter into a government agency agreement with Flock Group, Inc., a sole source vendor, for an automatic license plate reading system not to exceed cost of $57,150. First reading.
In consideration of requests made by a number of members, this will be held over for a second reading at our next meeting. Moving on to ordinances, Mrs. Knight, will you please read ordinance 017, 2023?
Ordinance number 017, 2023, an ordinance appropriating the filing of a petition for appropriation of certain real property and declaring an emergency. This is the property at 1567 West Main Street. This is the first reading.
Move to suspend.
Second.
It has been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Twist, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Move to adopt. Second.
It has been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Rozell, seconded by Mr. Twist. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the next ordinance of the evening, ordinance 018, 2023?
Ordinance number 018, 2023. An ordinance authorizing the filing of a petition for appropriation of certain real property and declaring an emergency. This is the parcel at 1533 West Main Street, first reading.
Move to suspend.
Second.
It has been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Twist, seconded by Mr. Pierce. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
It's been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Whidden, seconded by Mr. Rozell. The three-reading rule has been suspended. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Snead?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the last ordinance of the evening, ordinance O-19, 2023?
Ordinance number O-19, 2023. An ordinance authorizing the filing of a petition for appropriation of certain real property and declaring an emergency. This is the parcel at 1211 West Main Street. This is the first reading.
Move to suspend.
Second.
It has been moved to suspend the three-reading rule by Mr. Twist, seconded by Mrs. Snead. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Snead?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes. Move to adopt.
Second.
The three-reading rule has been suspended. It has been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Whidden, seconded by Mr. Twist. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Snead?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. We've come to the end of our agenda. Our next meeting will be Monday night, April 3rd, 7 o'clock right here in council chambers. So for those that have come, who have things to say, that will be your time to do it. Thank you very much for your attendance. Have a great weekend, everybody.